Welcome to a wonderful keynote presentation to be delivered by our esteemed and dear guest, our dear colleague, Professor Dr. Serhy Yekelchyk, who had come all the way from Victoria to be with us today. Serhy Yekelchyk will be speaking about history and historical misuses by the aggressor state and the leader of the aggressor state, on the premise of which we remember the war against Ukraine was all built on. Serhy Yekelchyk's title today of his presentation is Why Putin's Russia Attacked Ukraine. As I've mentioned, Dr. Yekelchyk is a professor in Victoria in the Department of Germanic and Slavic Studies at the University of Victoria. He's also a graduate from the University of Alberta, but prior to that, he's a graduate of Kyiv National University, eventually with MA from Ukrainian Academy of Sciences, and also with PhD in Russian and Eastern European history at the University of Alberta. That work has taken place some time ago. Since that, he had enjoyed and continues to enjoy a wonderful and very prolific career as a commentator and historian, writing and reflecting on history of Ukraine in relation and connection to global affairs, as we all remember reading those books from. His dissertation analyzed representations of the past in Stalinist culture, with special emphasis on Soviet Ukraine, and his book, Ukraine, Birth of a Modern Nation, was the first historical survey to include the 2004 Orange Revolution, and has since then been translated into 5 languages. Dr. Yekelchyk contributes articles to various printed and online journals, including the Wall Street Journal, Yahoo News, Blog, Politico, The Times Literary Supplement, Real Clear World, Real Clear History, and the Pioneer Briefing, and many more. I'm sure we're missing a few of those references. It does give us an immense pleasure to welcome you, Dr. Yekelchyk, today. We're very much looking forward to your thoughts, your ideas on what had been the precursor to that ugly, ugly war we all have been trying to understand since it all began. Thank you so much and welcome.
Thank you, Natalia, for your generous introduction. Thank you also, Natalia and Alexander, for the invitation to take part in this conference. I'm going to start with something which was not in the original drafts of my presentation at all, but all of you are going to understand me. When Mr. Trump announced that it was in fact Ukraine that started the war, then mentioned that President Zelensky had 4% approval rating and that he was a dictator, colleagues and commentators in the field found themselves scrambling to actually find the source of these statements. It took a little bit of time to realize that the source for the 4% is in fact the Russian media. It also became abundantly clear that the American president was now speaking based on the assumptions of how the world is being run, shared, identical, or borrowed from his Russian counterpart. This involved a few important considerations. It was obvious that he embraced the right of the strong and disrespected international law. That he did not process the experience of empire or the colonial past of his country, and that he also really liked authoritarianism. I'm talking about Trump here. He was also obviously very comfortable with justifying this disregard for international law by mentioning the security concerns, particularly in relation to Canada, but in the Ukrainian case as well. And it seemed that he was interested in stealing the resources. So in this exercise, we have noted certain similarities between the thinking of Mr. Trump and Mr. Putin. I actually quite like the comparison in the previous paper about what they have achieved and what they were still working on. But this perhaps can be our key to understanding the Russian strategy in Ukraine the Russian aims in Ukraine and how they are connected to the notion of disinformation or manipulating information. We also reached the stage yesterday of the National Security Advisor of the United States, Mike Waltz, speaking on behalf of the Russian state, saying that it certainly is not in Russia's interest to keep this war going and dragging on and on forever. Ignoring, of course, the fact that if the war is not in the Russian interests, then Russia can stop the war right away. Instead, he said, it was President Zelensky who was not showing his understanding that the war had to end. With that, we in North America entered the hall of mirrors where so many people reading the Russian media have been for a long time. The smoke and mirrors, the fog of war, the disinformation which fits with preconceived notions of how the world functions, how it should be run, is very clearly displayed in both cases. But it goes beyond that. It was particularly during the early stage of the war that a phenomenon called West-splaining was identified by some scholars. West-splaining is usually an exercise in Western political commentators, political scientists, and even some historians, explaining Ukraine to Ukrainians, in many cases, not having studied the country at all. Quite a few books appeared in which you wouldn't find a single reference to a source in Ukrainian. The number of overnight experts multiplied, and they felt very comfortable passing judgment on the war and the Ukrainian policies and proposing resolutions. And of course, it is difficult here to escape an impression that there is something that underlines this particular strategy of West-splaining as well. That is also the notion of the great powers being entitled to issue advice and threaten those who do not want to follow on that advice. Very often, in newspaper columns, on social media, and even in the books, some of them published by academic publishers, scholars explaining the causes of the war more and more often sounded like they were, in fact, justifying the war. Ukraine, in such accounts, was usually presented as constructed and artificial, but Crimea and the Donbas were, in fact, eternal and most definitely defined as Russian. The language, the titles of the books and articles themselves emphasized that point. The early writing about the conflict in Ukraine or the Ukraine conflict is still very much present with us. The word crisis slowly is disappearing, but not from all sectors of the academia. And the war in Ukraine, as if it is actually the war which is Ukrainian war, is also the kind of language that already comes with the built-in assumptions. I lived through that. I had a contract for the book with Oxford University Press, which was originally to be called The Crisis in Ukraine. At that point, fighting for the term conflict was already an achievement. We are talking about 2014. But then, of course, the next edition already only mentioned the name of the country, Ukraine. I also found so often in the language of scholars and commentators whom I respected tremendously the unconscious assumption that Russia is somehow in a unity which persists through the centuries and can be entitled to certain rights acquired during those centuries, even so they were based on imperial rule. I actually give my students a short article to read by a political scientist whom I greatly respect, who is in fact a friend of Ukraine. But The first sentence of this article actually reads, and that's my exercise for the students, to find out what is wrong, if anything, with the first sentence. The first sentence is that Crimea had been part of Russia from 1783 to 1954. The nature of this exercise, of course, to see students critically discuss the notion of which Russia, not to mention on what rights and circumstances that was based. So the Russian Empire, the imperial conquests of the Russian Empire are merged in such language with the policies of the Soviet state. The empire, which had included Alaska and a significant part of Poland, is presented as fully legitimate, and acquisitions during this period in one sentence already seem to be subconsciously accepted. Even if we watch the language very carefully, there is also the need to analyze what in fact is being said. There have been a number of attempted explanations on the Russian side of why its invasion of Ukraine was necessary. It was justified by a variety of factors. Even if we start only with 2022 and not with 2014, we would have to start with a planned false flag operation, very much on a model of Hitler in September 1939, which did not go forward because the Western intelligence made this knowledge public, that the false flag operation was in preparation. The notion of biological weapons labs located in Ukraine, allegedly by the United States and Western allies, they haven't been found yet. The notion of self-defense, which actually came in two varieties, but was quickly dismissed in both of them. One was in a more narrow meaning of Russia recognizing the two People's Republics of Luhansk and Donetsk as independent states, signing 10-year agreements with them, and then on the request of these two republics actually starting a war with Ukraine in self-defense. But it also comes in a second meaning, self-defense from Ukrainian Nazis who are in fact being schooled by NATO for an attack on Russia. Now, it has also been shown many times that the Russian notion of Nazis or neo-Nazis in Ukraine is in fact what psychologists would call projection. Many features of Mr. Putin's own regime are assigned to Ukraine and then condemned as Ukrainian. Even so, Ukraine has a Jewish president. Even so, presidents actually change in Ukraine, unlike in Russia. So against the background of this history of previous disinformation-based explanations, some of them continue to circulate in the West and enjoy a degree of academic respectability. The first one I need to mention in this respect is, of course, the evil NATO. If you do read the Russian press regularly, which I do for work, sometimes it is quite painful, but I have to, you would know that the war, in fact, was caused by NATO's attack on Russia through Ukraine. Sometimes there is a variation, the attack which we preempted by our response was a special military operation. And that, of course, the emphasis on the war actually being the war against NATO makes sense for certain aspects of Russian ideology and geopolitical thinking. But it is also shared by a number of Western scholars. Now, of course, in Ukraine, there is a sad joke about that Russia had lost hundreds of thousands of soldiers in its war against NATO before NATO even arrived to the battlefield. So that imaginary, symbolic conflict reflects, if anything, important components of Russian ideology. If we look deeper into the issue of Ukraine and NATO, first, The collaboration between Ukraine and NATO was established under President Kuchma in 1997. So it's not something evil and new created by pro-Western authorities. But also, the Ukrainian public didn't actually have significant support for joining NATO until Mr. Putin invaded. Moreover, the revolution of dignity in Ukraine in 2013-2014 was really more about the European Union than about NATO, but that's not the part Mr. Putin and his propagandists would like to emphasize. There is also a very interesting test here of how this explanation fails because it needs to be supplemented by other important elements of Russian identity. So this war against the West, represented allegedly by NATO, but in reality by Ukraine, is part and parcel of something larger. It also involves positioning Russia as the opposite of the West in terms of politics, rejecting democracy, for instance, suppressing the freedom of the press, eliminating the opposition physically if need be. But now, of course, the question can be asked whether it was NATO that somehow made Mr. Putin kill oppositional journalists and politicians. And the answer would, of course, be no. But that would indicate then that there is an additional dynamic here which needs to be included into analysis of Russian motives and false explanations for the invasion. Also, if the war is in fact about somehow restoring Russian history and reacquiring the so-called historical territories of Russia, then how does that fit exactly with defending Russia from NATO? This explanation seems to come from yet another direction, the third one, which we will now need to reconcile somehow together. There is then the need for the explanation that would bring together these factors and also explain the significance of Ukraine in particular. You could also perhaps consider the arguments produced by the Russian media and Mr. Putin in person that the war was the result of the Russian state caring about the Donbass, that particular historical region. But that does not actually fit with the history of the Russian politics in the Donbass between 2014 and 2022, because the Russian state made an effort to, in fact, keep the Donbass as part of Ukraine, but providing it with widespread autonomy and ideally the right to veto any important foreign policy decisions. That indicates that it was in fact not the Donbass, but Ukraine itself, the existence of Ukraine, which is different from the Russian world, that was in fact Mr. Putin's target. That also became impossible after 2021, because in fact establishing the Two People's Republic in the Donbass and annexing the Crimea from Ukraine essentially deprived this rationale from any political reason, because it was now impossible to form a significant electoral bloc within Ukraine which would build a pro-Russian Ukraine. That became an impossibility as a result of Mr. Putin's own actions. His yet another explanation that it was the Ukrainian reluctance to implement the Minsk agreements also doesn't hold water. That's because the Minsk agreements were old news by 2022, and neither side was happy in particular with the obligations they took under the Minsk agreements. In fact, both sides were trying to pick up the parts that they liked and not to implement the parts that they didn't like. So if we then are to look for an explanation that would combine all these threads or factors, we would need to arrive at First, the preliminary conclusion that the West perhaps misread something really important about Russian identity as something else. And I would argue that the West misread the neo-imperialism of Mr. Putin's Russia as a legitimate security interest or legitimate security concern, not realizing at first, at least, that in fact what was behind the alleged security concern was a deep connection between the domestic and foreign policy in Russia and, in particular, Mr. Putin's effort to recover Russia's empire and zone of influence in Eastern and Central Europe. So it does start making more sense if we look at the linkage between the dynamics within Russia, the domestic political scene, Russia's foreign policy, but also going beyond that, among these two policies and the notions of Russian identity and history. Both history as the past, which needs to be processed in a certain way, and history as a historical memory being mobilized by the state. It then becomes fairly clear that we are dealing not with realpolitik, with the realist explanations of foreign policy, but rather with the issues that concern belief and identity. A telling example comes from this last round of negotiations between Russia and the United States just before the all-out invasion in 2022. During a meeting between Secretary Blinken and Foreign Minister Lavrov, Blinken at the end of the meeting asks Lavrov, "So can you tell me what this is really all about? Is it about the security concern you have, the alleged NATO encroachment upon Russian territories? We can perhaps somehow deal with it. Or whether it really is about Mr. Putin's belief that Ukraine needs to be part of Russia in order for Russia to be somehow spiritually complete and a true great power." Lavrov looked at him and walked away without answering. So we would have to answer on his behalf. But yeah, I would actually start by adding the third element. Diplomats are such diplomats, right? He actually addressed Lavrov by the first name, Sergey. So what is you almost imagine saying, Adolf, what's this whole thing with Czechoslovakia and Poland? Can we solve it? Or no, or maybe we cannot solve it. But of course, back then it would be Mr. Chancellor. So, the third component we need to add, which Blinken was not bold enough to insert, would have to be the Russian authoritarianism. Because the notions of the NATO and alleged encroachments, and the notion of Ukraine as really being part of Russian historical territory, and in fact, the illegitimacy of the Ukrainian state, are intimately connected to the legitimation of Mr. Putin's own regime inside Russia. That is, to the survival and strengthening of his authoritarian regime. In other words, we are arriving here at the proposal that the Russian concept of national interest involves the past, and that past happens to be imperial. And it is processed or not processed in a certain way with implications for the present. Also, here, before I move any further, let me make a little bit of a sidestep to say that another proof that we are not dealing with rational calculations is in fact the very obvious idea that Mr. Putin miscalculated at the start of the all-out invasion. That he sought a quick dash towards Kyiv, or perhaps landing a few dozen paratroopers in the center of Kyiv would solve the problem by removing the president and the minister of defense, and then, of course, the Ukrainian state would collapse. That means, essentially, that he believed his own propaganda. And that, of course, the fate of so many dictators. They only receive the news they like. So that has certain implications for the current moment as well in the peace process. Now that Mr. Trump repeated the notion about the 4% support for Zelensky being a dictator, now we realize that perhaps Russia is pushing for the elections in Ukraine based on the same mistaken assumptions about Ukrainian identity as it did in 2022. In other words, they want to believe that Zelensky only has 4% support. But of course, if the elections were held in Ukraine, it is highly likely that Zelensky would be re-elected. And if not, the person elected instead of him would be even more committed to protecting and defending the Ukrainian state. So it seems that we are dealing with a continued refusal to accept the notion of a civic or political Ukrainian identity, which is so central to present-day Ukraine. Not just that, it continues to be the one informing the Russian foreign policy as of today, and now, of course, apparently informing Mr. Trump's foreign policy too, which is quite scary. But dictators like each other, so that's the reason why Zelensky is not a dictator, because Mr. Trump would have liked him. He likes dictators, right, as you know. Right, Russia, North Korea, the list goes on. So resisting the alleged NATO invasion does not really fit with the notions of gathering the Russian world, saving the Donbass, restoring historical borders. Or does it? Perhaps it does if we assume that the presence of Ukraine as a symbol of democracy and Western orientation actually is interpreted by Mr. Putin as the NATO invasion. That is, of course, the invasion of a political nature, the invasion of civil society, the invasion of free elections, and he would fight till the end against such an invasion. But he would not actually recognize what is, in fact, happening. Now, there's an argument can be made, and has been made, that Mr. Putin, in fact, is speaking to the domestic audience with a significant amount of this propaganda material. That is perhaps true, but we need to be clear about what the domestic audience is getting from them and what is his intended outcome. Very often you would hear about Ukraine potentially serving as an example for the Russian society and Mr. Putin being afraid of it for that reason. But it seems that the actual experience of dealing with Russian society, in fact, prepared Mr. Putin for his need to crush Ukraine. Mr. Putin faced significant protests in major cities during 2011 and 2012. He then came back to power as president in 2012 and started a new program of cleansing the information space and the civil society space from various quote-unquote foreign agents, organizations, museums, the Memorial Society, allegedly funded by the West. So he was, in fact, cleansing his own society just to make sure that there is nothing, no platform, no opportunity for Russia to articulate any other option. That is true. However, shall we assume the liberal democratic mantra about society producing on its own the notion of self-determination, respect for minority rights and human rights? Not necessarily. It is widely acknowledged that the annexation of Crimea was received by the Russian public as the great holiday, including some scholars teaching in North America, who celebrated this event as a restoration of kind of historical justice. But of course, that's a very peculiar interpretation of justice, which relies on the imperial assumption behind it. That is, Crimea became quote-unquote Russian in 1783, and it remained Russian until 1954. But the reality, of course, is that 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 particular stage of being Russian involved a number of colonial and genocidal policies, resulting in fact in ethnic Russians becoming a majority on the peninsula over the course of 3 nights in May 1944, with the deportation of the Crimean Tatars and also the Greeks, Armenians, and some other minority groups. Essentially, it resulted from an ethnic cleansing which was bleeding into a genocide. So that's what we are talking about, that Crimea being Russian in this sense, of course, would hold a totally different meaning from what is usually meant when saying that Crimea is Russian. So also, Mr. Putin keeps talking about history, comparing himself to Ivan III, Ivan IV, and Peter I. What exactly does this mean? Did they fight NATO? Ivan III was actually married to a Greek woman who grew up in Italy. So he was perhaps also, if you look real deep into the documents, was a traitor, a Western agent, a foreign agent. However, Ivan III was also the one who proposed the notion of Russia as an empire, who borrowed the double-headed eagle from the Byzantine Empire through his Italian-Greek wife. And it is through that that history starts making sense for us when we look at Mr. Putin's actions. He wants to be compared to the great rulers of the empire, those who conquered. Would that be possible, perhaps? Would that be acceptable to some scholars of the realist school? Is the empire a good thing? Recovering the empire? Whitewashing colonial crimes? One would think that these things would not sound good in the 21st century, and yet somehow in the context of Mr. Putin's actions, they do. And they seem fine by some American politicians as well. What then happens here is, of course, that we must acknowledge that the security vision, to whatever degree it is a genuine security concern, and the geopolitical understanding of Russia's place in the world and the Russian national interest are in fact all linked to neo-imperialism. Russia's own identity is involved there deeply. Now, in what way is it involved is actually a good question. Most narratives about the causes of the war start in 1991. And yes, the collapse of the Soviet Union makes perfect sense as a starting point. I was present. I was, in fact, in Kiev and remember perfectly well the brief moment of elation in August 1991 when for 4 days, it seemed that a democratic Russia would be possible and it could live in peace with Ukraine. Then, on day 4, the press secretary of President Yeltsin made his infamous announcement about potentially having territorial claims on Ukraine and other republics of the former Soviet Union. So it actually lasted for 3 days only. It does make sense also that the trajectory of the two countries was established during the 1990s. They both emerged from a rather comparable situation in terms of political tradition, the economy, the society. But by the end of the 1990s, it became clear that Russia is moving decisively in the direction of not just restoring itself as a regional player, which was the point of the press secretary's announcement, but actually challenging the West as such and claiming that the West is the only potential partner in negotiations, that the political stature of Russia is in fact similar to the United States. And that's why so many champagne bottles were uncorked in Moscow after a certain meeting in Saudi Arabia recently. A recognition of sorts of the thinking Mr. Putin wanted to validate for a long time, that Russia's proper position in international affairs had been taken from it in a coup, and establishing that, in fact, it is only the United States who are worthy of sitting at the same table with the Russian delegation, justified a variety of salient points in the Russian narrative of how international relations work. If we then consider this point on its merits and say that Ukraine is a domestic issue as much as it is a foreign policy issue, and that Ukraine stands for something else in Russian ideology, we would need then perhaps to note that Ukraine is not just one of former imperial territories. Because we could have said about, I don't know, Kazakhstan, actually, a very interesting example of Kazakhstan, right? The place where the Russian paratroopers arrived and speedily left after fewer than 1 week. That never happens, I think, in Russian history. But you could, in fact, accuse any other republic of the former Soviet Union of being an ungrateful former subject. That's precisely what the Russian media does. But in the Ukrainian case, it goes deeper. And the fact that it goes deeper has very interesting implications here. Let me deal with them. So, Mr. Putin claims that Russians and Ukrainians are, in fact, a single people, that they have common historical destiny, and for that reason, any Ukrainian state is not a legitimate one. Ukraine is not entitled to its nation state. But what does it mean exactly if his troops arrive into Ukraine? And it turns out that even those Ukrainians he was prepared to accept as members of the same people do not welcome his army with flowers. That would mean that they are nationalists. So in the language of the Russian media, throughout the war, but especially after the all-out invasion of 2022, there were variations of how to address the people in Ukraine who resist. At first, they were Nazis. The Ukrainian Nazis are resisting. The Ukrainian nationalists are resisting. But then, when it became the war of attrition, it became very clear that it cannot be that there are so many Nazis and nationalists in Ukraine. And actually, they are right. They aren't, right? Then, a new way of talking about it was invented. It was the armed forces of Ukraine and foreign mercenaries. Nevertheless, that was actually a significant acknowledgement compared to the previous explanations of who exactly it was that fought against Russia in Ukraine. So here, though, we need to perhaps try to dig a little bit deeper. We have heard, or at least we, speaking of historians of 19th century Ukraine, of which I am one, and Alexander works on that, and I can perhaps see other people in the audience, this whole notion that Ukraine consists of Russians, or those who are really Russian, and nationalists, is actually a very familiar one for a historian of 19th century Ukraine and the Russian Empire. In the Russian Empire, there was a very similar ambiguity about who the people are in Ukraine. For that particular reason, but also because it didn't have logistical capacity, the empire did not assimilate the Ukrainian peasants. It didn't try to do so. It just prevented the Ukrainian patriots from accessing the peasantry through the prohibitions of publishing in Ukrainian, through arresting and exiling Ukrainian activists. But it did not try to assimilate them, because the empire proceeded on a pre-modern notion of religious unity of three Eastern Slavic people and perhaps other Orthodox Christians in the empire. Georgia comes to mind here. That would be the notion which is very familiar. But of course, that's also the notion which implies that whoever claims that Ukraine is separate is a nationalist enemy and should be prosecuted. So in a way, acknowledging this ethnic factor here is something that can, in fact, lead to atrocities, war crimes, and genocide. Because a certain proportion of the Ukrainian population, which grows bigger and bigger with every year, is being acknowledged as Nazis, nationalists, mercenaries, and the armed forces of Ukraine. those who cannot be potentially incorporated into the wonderful Russian Empire to be restored by Mr. Putin. That means that they need to be murdered. That means that the children can be picked up from Ukraine and deported into Russia to be placed with proper Russian families. That demonstrates the kind of thinking you would see in the Russian Empire before 1917, but that also demonstrates something which is, in fact, a war crime according to the international law. I think I have arrived at the point where I have to say that Russia never really processed the notion of having been an empire. It has been argued by others, and myself as well, that the Russian elites were always so focused on building and preserving the empire that they never got around to actually inculcating a separate Russian national consciousness or Russian national idea. So it remained imperial definitely until 1917, but it also remained very much in action after the Bolshevik Revolution. In 1919, Stalin argues infamously in an article about the military situation on the Southern Front that the reason for the Bolshevik victories is that they are supported by the great Russians and the great Russian working class. So he seems to be speaking as a Marxist, but he really is speaking about the empire here, just trying to attach class history to it. There was never a longer period of actually coming to terms with the Russian past. In the 1920s, it was acknowledged that the colonial past was bad, but Stalin actually personally issued reservations, including, in particular, limiting the critique of the Russian actions in order not to antagonize the Russian working class. But what he really meant was that, of course, you should not antagonize the Russian cities that occupy a very peculiar, very recognizable colonial position among the Ukrainian countryside. So it was never fully accepted as a hard policy. Terry Martin says that Ukrainization of the 1920s was a soft policy, not a hard policy, not the really important, not the one which was constitutive of the Soviet state. And of course it ended in the 1930s. And then the empire was brought back. So here, let me actually challenge another very popular Russian historical myth, that the 1954 transfer of the Crimea from Russia to Ukraine was somehow strengthening Ukraine at the expense of poor Russia. Well, unfortunately, that particular act came together with a powerful ideological statement, the thesis of the Central Committee on the 300th anniversary of the Pereyaslav Treaty, which rehabilitated the term reunification in relation to Ukraine and Russia. So that was the moment when the Tsarist Empire, with its vocabulary, came back already in the Soviet period and was restored as a generally positive thing, because the empire was something that brought Russians and Ukrainians together. As well, the transfer of Crimea, perhaps, was also intended to balance Ukraine, given the continued insurgency in the western provinces. So this is where Mr. Putin grows from. He develops ideologically from that moment in post-war history, where the conquest of Ukraine and its absorption into Russia is presented as reunification, as if they were the parts of the same nation. That's the origins of his ideology. In this sense, the moment of reckoning with the empire never came. Yeltsin only had 4 days for it. He actually wanted to pick up an example, to pick up a line in historical memory that would be different from the Russian Empire. And his advisors looked in 1917 at the Russian Provisional Government. But of course, the Russian Provisional Government was one of the first indications that Russian democracy ends where Ukrainian question begins. So in 1917, of course, the Provisional Government was not prepared to recognize Ukraine in its fullness. And actually, the areas to be claimed already then apparently included the Donbass and the Black Sea, if we believe Volodymyr Vinnychenko in his description of negotiations with the provisional government. Already then, for the Russian Democrats, whom Yeltsin wanted to lionize, Ukraine had to be limited to central Ukraine because the rest surely was Russian. So, having described this presence of history, and yet at the same time the lack of proper critical engagement with history, the lack of recognition that Russia was in fact an empire, the lack of developing a Russian national interest as opposite to the interest of the empire, be it the Russian Empire or the Soviet Union, we now understand fully why Mr. Zelensky has to be illegitimate, both for Mr. Putin and for Mr. Trump. Well, that's because he represents the Ukrainian political nation, even so he is clearly not a Ukrainian Nazi, or ethnic Ukrainian, or ethnic Ukrainian nationalist. But because he represents something which is the most threatening for the empire, the political, the civic nation, rather than an ethnic one, he needs to be illegitimate, which of course is based on the Mr. Putin is probably deeply regretful of the fact that he did recognize Ukraine after the Revolution of Dignity. He conducted negotiations with Ukraine, had phone calls with President Poroshenko, the infamous ones which ended with, I shake your hand, hugs and such, right? So he did recognize Ukraine as legitimate during that period. He now needs to somehow connect President Zelensky to what he describes as an illegitimate coup promoted by the West, which brought the ethnic nationalists and Nazis to power. So it is, in fact, that is the reason why Zelensky is illegitimate. And that is also the reason which enables genocide. If we consider Mr. Putin's aims in this war, one observation to be made is the obsession with history does come with a certain cost, which Adolf Hitler had demonstrated. If it is the political regime which represents the past as idealized, set against the society which represents the future, because it is not an ethnic-based idea of Ukraine. It is the nation of Mustafa Najem and President Zelensky, as well as great many Ukrainian patriots. Then the overall outcome over the period of time would in fact be predictable, no matter how hard the present moment appears to be. There is already, I think, a clear understanding that if Mr. Putin wanted to destroy Ukraine or make it Russian, he failed in that already. And it's not, in fact, possible, no matter how successful his armies might be in the next few years if the war goes on, that is not going to happen. There will never be an understanding of Ukraine as part of Russia and the Ukrainian people as constituting the same nation with the Russians. He might be, perhaps, partially successful in his second objective, namely establishing that Russia is a great power that can only speak to the United States, not even Europe, nor, God forbid, Ukraine, but only the United States. Well, perhaps this one is not going to last for too long either, because very clearly the slogans of making America great again and making Russia great again are in fact cannot be reconciled with each other. And the time is bound to demonstrate that. And in addition to the methods other participants of this conference have discussed, combating disinformation, mapping the communities, figuring out how it works and what would be the most effective response to it, there's also the category of practice. Because these are not all abstract notions. There are people who act on them, and the number of people who volunteer and act on the Ukrainian side are incomparably, in terms of a share, percentage, higher than it is on the Russian side. There is also such thing as people's diplomacy, when even so, Ukraine may have unresolved historical issues with some of its neighbors to the west. But it is at the level of the families in those countries accepting Ukrainian refugees or displaced Ukrainians, the notion of how you understand the nature of the conflict becomes grounded in the actual act of kindness, of helping the other and hearing the other's story and making it your own story as well. So in praxis, in the belief in a mobilized civil society being always stronger than an autocracy, which is moreover confused about its nature, lies our greatest hope. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Serhy, for bringing in the perspective and an historian on the topic of our conference. When we were, in fact, mulling over our idea who we want to have as a keynote speaker, we knew who to go for. Your work speaks for itself. You have spent a tremendous amount of time on reflecting on revisioning historical projects which are currently being on the go on behalf of the Russian president. And I want just to formulate a question on the fly, and then I'll open up the discussion for all. Our attempt to bridge your knowledge, your expertise on historical revisionist and reconstructionist, as it's been happening in the world right now based on the Russian Federation's efforts, and our efforts on the other side to host and run this particular conversation on misinformation and disinformation, to me, merge at some point. And I want to ask this question to you, whether you see that being two parallel processes, one growing after the other, or one informing the other. What comes to mind is the July 21st, 2021 document. You had referred to it as well, of course. And it's been discussed for a while as one of the pivotal changing moments in history. We all were in that moment remembering what it meant to read this document and see it published and publicized. Is there a point where historical revisionist project ends and disinformation, as we are addressing in this particular room, begins?
They are connected for sure, because the choices of useful past made by an authoritarian regime, which is bent on restoring the empire and a sphere of influence going beyond the empire, are going to be the choices that clearly demonstrate what kind of idea, what kind of identity they want to cultivate. So the clearest example here of distinction between Russia and Ukraine, which is very relevant for our analysis of this war, is of course the existing adoration of Stalin under Mr. Putin's regime, right? One way of divergence between Ukraine and Russia in the 2000s, really, not really the 1990s, but perhaps more so in the 2000s, was in fact the acknowledgement that Ukrainians are now being well educated about Stalin's crimes, including the genocidal famine, the Holodomor. Whereas in Russia, there continued to be uncertainty about it. Is Stalin an unequivocally good manager and political figure, or is he perhaps not worthy of serving as a symbol of Russia? But he persists, right? There was, in fact, an episode which made me think right away about the notions of what are we dealing with this here. When in 2017, finally, after a great many delays, a monument to the victims of Stalinist terror was opened in Moscow, Mr. Putin showed up at the unveiling ceremony and gave a speech lasting half an hour in which he didn't mention Stalin's name even once. However, he was very happy to speak about the Bolsheviks, the revolutionaries, because it was now the terror had to be assigned to Marxists, to the revolutionaries. Stalin had to be protected. And so also, actually, there is another parallel. The revolutionaries were, of course, foreign agents as well, which some people saw in 1917 too. So Mr. Putin, there are multiple parallels here of how you remember your past and how it is connected to the notion of human rights. And I think this really is important. So if the emphasis is on the importance of the state, держава, that term which functions so differently in Ukrainian and Russian, of course, the great power in the Russian iteration of this term. So if you mobilize the past, then you're actually projecting it into the future as well. But that, of course, is also forcing us to consider the question of how the imperial past of Russia would need to be addressed. Given all this, ecstasy about bringing Crimea back into home harbor and such, in fact, the observation made by some social scientists that with every act of Russian aggression, Putin's popularity goes up right away at the same time. That indicates, of course, something important. It's not just Mr. Putin's war. It is a war in which a significant share of the Russian society has its investment as well, and it is an investment which comes as part of their identity. The empires take a long, long time to deal with this, as we now observe in present-day world as well. So there is actually a very clear logic in the fact that the term decolonization became so popular in Ukrainian studies. Ukraine is not a classical colony. There's much more complex relationships there, but the very term, of course, involved that you can no longer unambiguously celebrate the empire, and that was what was important for Ukrainian commentators and public figures, I think.
Fascinating. Thank you so much yet again. We have this wonderful opportunity for a broad conversation. We're waiting for your questions to be raised.
Thank you. I'm struggling because I basically agree with everything you said, and it was a very rich keynote, so you covered just about everything. I have a comment on the demand for elections in Ukraine. I think, yes, it might be a miscalculation, but I think it also might be something that Russia would like to use in a future negotiation process, just as they did in the Minsk Accords, that they demanded changes to the constitution before implementing anything on their side. I think you're absolutely right that empires fall very slowly. St. Petersburg, or that area, used to be Swedish. We no longer have claims on it, I can assure you. But it took a few centuries. And also I remember reading a comment in the British Empire when they were involved in reclaiming authority in America. One commentator in London, he wrote a letter and he said, "This is the kind of war in which even victory will ruin us." So if you look ahead, and because history is the only teacher we have, what do you see for Russia in the future?
It's a great question. Let me start by saying there was actually a very interesting moment in this war, which I don't think received sufficient coverage in the West. And that was when the Ukrainian troops crossed the border into the Kursk Oblast of Russia. There was a point made by the Ukrainian authorities that we are not going to claim this territory as Ukrainian territory. So we are going to govern it for now as we control it, but it will be restored to Russia at some future point. And to me, having seen all these ethnographic maps from the early 20th century, and actually my family on my mom's side is from that particular borderland region where Kursk and Oryol Oblast were in fact populated very significantly by Ukrainians as well, that was a very important moral stand. Right? We are different. We are not like you. And this is how it should, in fact, be in the future, if you consider not the state, but human rights and society as the guiding principles. Regarding the future, there are quite a few possible scenarios. My first few books are actually on Stalinism, and I continue publishing that too. Nobody in the West had any idea what would happen in the case of Stalin's death. No idea whatsoever. However, the moment he died, turned out that most successors or potential successors were all in favor of some significant reforms, which they did start at implementing. What it tells us is that we do not have a good reading on what Russian society is like. There are negative indications, there are some limited positive indications. We don't quite know. So we are back to the period when, 1953, the American intelligence has no idea what, in fact, is happening there, what will be the case. My method of measuring the possibilities is actually checking how many mainstream Russian politicians condemned the war and mentioned that it will end in either military or moral victory for Ukraine and the need for reparations and such. And only two figures in Russian politics, really, two big figures, a few smaller ones, but still important. And that was, of course, Alexei Navalny, who mentioned that one way of dealing with Russia's defeat, whether it is military or moral, will be sending a significant share of proceeds from oil and gas sales to Ukraine as reparations. And then, of course, he died in prison. There was also a very brief acknowledgement from Ksenia Sobchak, who is not really a politician, but a public figure of some renown, who was hugged by Mr. Putin 3 days ago at a concert in memory of his father. He made a point of hugging her and kissing her on the cheek and such. And yet she was the only one of major kind of people who still have public voice who said that Crimea is Ukrainian. Then she added, according to the international law. There is a very cautious acknowledgement in some circles that Russia is going to need a policy for the end game, not after the end of the war, but after the end of Mr. Putin's regime in whatever form it comes. And then, of course, there is a possibility that Mr. Putin will be succeeded by another person who also has revanchist designs on Ukraine and Europe and the world as well. Here, a historian would look at precedents from World War I and the interwar period in which several revanchist states existed in Europe and how that shaped European politics. And that was also the period, of course, when the United States decided that America needs to be first. And they actually withdrew from Europe politically and militarily, and also passed a legislation which banned funding of any belligerents in future conflicts, which is why Roosevelt needed the Lend-Lease program in order to support China, the UK, and the Soviet Union in the fight against Nazi Germany. So there are quite a few threads that come in together here that are mightily resonant. They have a potential of, being ominous for something bad, but also they have the potential of us finding out that things are in fact better than they thought they were, like it was the case with Stalin's death.
Why the fascination with Stalin? How did that start?
I have my favorite story, which I always tell in class. When the polls in Russia trying to determine who was the greatest historical figure in Russia, if Mr. Putin is included, he is, needlessly to say, of course, first. But if Mr. Putin is excluded, then it is a competition between Stalin and Tsar Nicholas II. Yeah, I know. You cannot put these two in the same room. They would strangle each other, right?
Well, I think Stalin would win.
No. The Tsar was in a really good physical shape. Yeah. He was older, but in a good shape. Yeah. My money is on the Tsar. Yeah. But it's too late now, right? I think, there are multiple layers here of how we remember them. But of course, the question then becomes of what it is that brings these two figures together that are so opposite politically. And the only answer to that would be the idea of a great power. So the Tsar himself is weak politically as a political player, but he represents the Russian Empire. Stalin is quite strong politically. He's a dictator. He's a Marxist. He says so, at least, right? But he also creates a great power. He acquires nuclear weapons by stealing the design from the Americans. He forces the West to count with the Soviets. He manages to reshape the map of Europe. I wish we knew as much about the negotiations today as we know about Yalta, with all these matchsticks being moved on the map of Europe by Churchill, and all kinds of small things. We do that, you do that. You scratch my back, I'll help you here, right? So Stalin and the Tsar represent the great power, the great empire. That's the only thing which actually propels them into the top positions in the pantheon of great Russians, which is curious in more than one way, also because Stalin is technically not a Russian. But very famously, his daughter says to his son, our father once had been a Georgian. Because politically, under Stalin, he functions as representative of Russia. And I can go on for a long time. That's the subject of my books and the course.
Just small clarification. What about figure of Vladimir Veliky? He's also kind of very much inspiring figure for Vladimir Putin, and they all actually just built a new monument in front of Kremlin. How can that exist, like a three of these figures, Stalin, Vladimir Veliky, and Nikolai Tsar, kind of coexist in this ecosystem of Russian brain?
Because we don't know much about Prince Vladimir, really. So you can write all kinds of national dreams onto him and make him a symbol of something. And that was also the process which can be traced back to Imperial Russia. The first modern monument in Kiev, Ukraine, is a monument to Prince Vladimir, but is still seen not fully as a monument to a state figure, but rather to a person who brought Christianity. So in this sense, he is a wonderful, we don't know what he looked like, right? So before the age of drones, the wonderful decision for the sculpture was to turn his face to the heavens. And before the age of drones, you wouldn't know what he looked like because he is looking over there. So you can project all kinds of dreams on him. And this brings me to actually a fairly interesting point. Namely, the most recent importance of Crimea in Russian historical mythology as the region from which Christianity came to Russia. So it's no longer Kiev. No longer the chronicle story about Prince Vladimir forcing the Kievans into the waters of the Dnipro River and such. It now is, based on rather problematic sources, the notion that Christianity came through Crimea. That creates an additional justification for why Crimea is so important for Russian history, allegedly.
So allow me to thank Professor Yekelchyk for providing us with this big, deep and background picture so we can build on our conversations going forward. Thank you, Serhy.
Thank you very much.